Welcome to Pathophysiology. Hopefully this semester you have a lot of fun watching these videos and playing along with the game. And I call it a game because differential diagnosis is just like a game. Throughout the semester I'll introduce the rules to the game. Just like any game that you start playing at first, you're maybe a little bit hesitant or worried about the game because you don't know the rules, but don't worry about it. Throughout the semester I'm going to slowly introduce any new rules, make sure they're clear, and then let you work on your own from there. The cool thing about the game, once you learn the rules, it's so easy and so fun to play the game. And diagnosing pathophysiology is just like that. We're talking about the physiology because when you understand how physiology works and you break any one piece of that chain, you create this reaction that changes everything. So we're going to talk a little bit about the physiology, and hopefully you remember your physiology and your anatomy because you're going to have it all semester long. But then we're going to talk about the patho part, so the disease part of it. We're going to talk about what happens when you change one element in that pathway, or what happens when you introduce something to the body that breaks the pathway. So, like I said, we're going to talk about a lot of the rules. We're going to talk about the basics too. I'll refresh your anatomy, refresh your physiology, and then we're going to apply those rules to what would happen if you broke that. And you probably remember from physiology things like the endocrine system, or you can think, pathway of hormones. If you turn off any one hormone in the pathway, it's like a domino effect. It shuts off all the other hormones in the pathway. Cardiovascular system. If you block flow to an organ, you know what happens to the organ. It starves, it dies, and then that'll be a symptom. So we'll talk about how to apply those rules from knowing your physiology. Also, like I said, I'm going to be here for guidance. So I'm going to try and make sure that everything's accessible to you. The directions in the syllabus we'll go over when we meet in class for the first day. I'll talk about how you do the homework, how you submit the homework, how you get everything turned in, how you know exactly what things are due and when they're due. And I try and keep everything as consistent as possible throughout the semester, which we'll talk about that first day that we meet in class too. I want to make sure that every week you can count on the same steps to get things done. So you get into a nice pattern and the flow just makes it easier so you can focus on the learning and not wondering what you have to do. Right, so hopefully throughout the semester I'll keep you on the edge of your seat, and I really want to keep you thinking, oh my God, I can't believe this really happens, or is this really possible? So I'm going to introduce a lot of diseases that maybe you haven't heard of, but you might be introduced into. Which brings me to another thing. I'm not a big fan of actually beating into your head diseases you'll probably never ever hear of again, or they're so rare that somebody wrote a paper on it one time and that's why we have the name of the disease. I really focus on the primary things you'll have to deal with. I sometimes do list off some diseases that they're kind of rare, but there's a chance that you might be introduced to them, especially if it helps reiterate a concept from physiology, or so that it helps you understand another disease or another pathway. So if you hear something rare, I might actually point out that you don't have to memorize this, but you really have to understand the concept. And then, like I said, hopefully you have a lot of fun this semester learning those different things. So hopefully you're ready to have your mind a little bit challenged and have some fun doing it. So let's start with some history. This is an extremely general history of disease. If you could buy a whole textbook on the history of disease and all the things that have happened. But I just think it's kind of interesting that man's been on the earth, depending on what perspective you look at, evolutionarily, about 3 million years. And we've been getting sick ever since day one. So since the first man was out there, we've had diseases. What's interesting is that how we've treated the diseases. Because, of course, from the biblical perspective, God created these diseases to punish man, as a lot of the philosophies. And so it really was supported by the church that if you got sick, then you were a sinner, or there was something wrong with you. And then if there was no mystery, or if there was no way to identify what was causing it, and it was this big mystery, then we'd come up with these really weird treatments. They were totally anecdotal, which means if we treated one person with a disease with this one treatment and it worked, then presto, it was a miracle cure and everybody should be treated. Not necessarily giving credit to the body having repaired itself while they were going through this ridiculous treatment. So I'll show you some of those. So one of the oldest diseases that we think of was actually cured by drilling a hole in the person's head. So they think that caveman or Neanderthal, and they found evidence that these old therapies were used on them as old as 10,000 years ago. And we can only imagine that maybe somebody had a sinus infection or a migraine headache, so what did they do? They drilled a hole in their head. They thought, well, this person must have angered the gods or they had a demon inside of them, so if you drill a hole, it would let the demons escape. What's interesting is that we still do this, and if you know the name of drilling a hole in the head or cutting a hole in the skull, it's called a craniotomy. But of course, we understand the disease is a little bit better and the purpose of it. It's interesting when you look at some of these things like this squared hole, and you can see where the cuts Imagine when this was actually made 10,000 years ago, they just had a sharp rock. So could you imagine the person with this bad headache, someone cutting away at their head with a sharp rock and just saying, one more minute, we're almost in. We're almost about to let this demon go free. I think at the point where someone was cutting onto my head, I'd totally forget about the pain in my head. And I'd be more worried about the pain on the outside. Another excuse was biblical uncleanliness. So 2,000 years before Christ, there was this disease. It didn't have a name, Hansen's disease, at the time, but it was one of the most common diseases or plagues on man. And today we call it leprosy, and they actually call it leprosy in the Bible too. But they assumed that leprosy was this punishment from God for being a sinner. So what's interesting is the treatment that they used. Get 2 birds, kill one, dip the live bird in the blood of the dead one, sprinkle the blood on the leper 7 times. And it was this ritual of going through this. Leprosy is actually more of a skin issue and what's happening to the surface of the skin, the muscle, and it can actually dig down to the bones. But when you cut off circulation, then you can actually lose fingers. So when we talk about leprosy later, we'll actually talk about more of the common things and not the extreme versions so much. I love this one too. So if you can't come up with the actual cause, they must be a vampire. It's funny because there are a lot of history going back with vampirism, and they think that one of the main causes, there are actually a couple causes of quote-unquote vampirism, was TB. So when you look at symptoms of TB, the person's eyes were really bloodshot, they looked very evil looking, their